In a world where trust is shattered and betrayal lurks around every corner, one man must face the greatest challenge of his life. Nathan Raines, once a tech mogul with everything to lose, finds himself caught in a web of deceit spun by his closest allies. A powerful syndicate, ruthless and hidden in the shadows, controls everything from behind the scenes. After discovering the truth about the Black Net Syndicate, Nathan is forced to make an impossible choice: seek revenge, or fight for something greater. The stakes have never been higher, and every decision could be his last. With the help of his ally, Grace, and a team of unlikely partners, Nathan begins a dangerous mission to expose the syndicate and bring its leaders to justice. But when secrets unravel and loyalties are tested, the line between hero and villain becomes harder to see. Join us as we dive into a tale of power, deception, and redemption. This is a story where betrayal runs deep, alliances are fragile, and the fight for survival is only the beginning. Are you ready to witness the battle that will change everything? Let the story begin. Nathan Carter returned home early from a tech summit in Berlin, driven by a nagging suspicion that his wife, Isla, might be hiding something. For weeks, he'd felt an unexplainable distance between them. His intuition led him to return unexpectedly, and as he walked through the front door, the unmistakable sounds of soft laughter echoed through the hall. What he found shattered his reality. Isla, his high-powered corporate wife, was in their bedroom with her colleague, Simon Reed. Nathan stood frozen, watching them embrace, unable to speak, but inside, his world collapsed. He didn't confront them then and there. Instead, he quietly left the room, gathering his thoughts. He needed to know more, to have proof of what he had suspected. Nathan was no stranger to business strategies and cold calculations. He would get his revenge. The next morning, Nathan made the cold decision to file for divorce. He handed Isla the papers, his voice emotionless. "I want out," he told her, his calmness only serving to add to the shock on her face. Without hesitation, he moved out, taking his share of assets with him. His first course of action was to consult with a lawyer and safeguard his wealth. But Nathan didn't stop there. Knowing that Simon's influence was not limited to his professional life, Nathan hired Grace Elliott, a private investigator with a reputation for uncovering hidden truths. Nathan also reached out to Emily, Simon's wife, after learning she had started to suspect her husband's infidelity as well. Emily was willing to cooperate, eager for revenge herself. With Grace and Emily's help, Nathan dug deep into Simon's past, uncovering a series of questionable financial practices that went back years. Simon had embezzled funds from clients, forging reports and manipulating investments for personal gain. Nathan's investigative team unearthed emails, surveillance footage, and financial records that proved Simon's illegal activities beyond a shadow of a doubt. Meanwhile, Nathan began strategically leaking this damning information. He made sure it found its way to the right people in Simon's business circles, fellow investors, media outlets, and competitors. The truth spread like wildfire, leaving Simon's business and reputation in tatters. His credibility was shot, and the once promising tech mogul was suddenly a pariah in the industry. The fallout from the exposed fraud was swift. Simon faced multiple investigations and lawsuits, losing everything he had worked so hard to build. He was publicly disgraced, and his career as a tech entrepreneur was effectively over. Isla, on the other hand, was not immune to the consequences. The divorce proceedings were long and brutal, but Nathan made sure that she received nothing from their shared assets. The public nature of the scandal, combined with the revelation of her infidelity, led to her being shunned by many of her former colleagues and friends. The lifestyle she had taken for granted vanished in an instant. She was left alone, struggling to rebuild a life without the security and luxury she had once enjoyed. Nathan, however, was not dwelling in his past. He used his inheritance wisely, founding a cutting-edge cybersecurity firm, specializing in data protection and threat prevention. His business grew rapidly, becoming a key player in an increasingly digital world where security was paramount. Nathan not only recovered financially but also found a new sense of purpose, helping companies safeguard against the very types of financial fraud he had suffered from. At a cybersecurity conference, Nathan met Mia Williams, a fellow entrepreneur passionate about data privacy. They bonded over shared values and mutual respect, and their professional relationship quickly blossomed into something more. Mia was not only brilliant and supportive but also someone who helped Nathan heal from the betrayal that had once consumed him. Nathan also found himself mentoring young tech entrepreneurs, sharing his hard-won wisdom about navigating the business world and protecting oneself from the kinds of traps he'd fallen into. He used his platform to inspire others to take control of their future and make ethically sound decisions. But just when Nathan thought he was finally free of the chaos Simon had brought into his life, Simon launched a final, desperate attack. Using his remaining resources, Simon initiated a series of cyber attacks on Nathan's company, aiming to destroy everything he had worked for. The attacks were sophisticated, involving targeted malware and data breaches meant to compromise his firm's operations. Nathan, however, had anticipated such a move. With his team of cybersecurity experts, he was able to trace and counter Simon's efforts quickly. The hackers Simon had hired were identified, arrested, and charged with cyber crimes. Simon's own involvement in the attacks became public knowledge, and his criminal activities were brought to light once more, adding to his growing list of charges. Simon, realizing the extent of his failure, was arrested and faced a lengthy prison sentence for his actions. The legal and financial consequences of his misdeeds caught up with him. With Simon in prison, Nathan was finally able to close that dark chapter of his life. Nathan had triumphed, but the war was not yet over. With Simon imprisoned and Isla out of his life, Nathan focused all his energy on growing his cybersecurity firm into an industry leader. His relationship with Mia grew stronger, and together they made a formidable team in both business and life. As Nathan took on new challenges and continued to expand his business, he felt a renewed sense of freedom. He had learned the hard way to trust his instincts, to protect himself, and to never let betrayal define him. His past no longer haunted him. He had emerged stronger and wiser. And though Simon was behind bars, the story wasn't quite over. The digital age held many dangers, and Nathan knew there would always be challenges ahead. But for now, he was on the rise. His life was no longer defined by the betrayal he had suffered, but by the opportunities and relationships he had built. As Nathan continued to navigate his successful venture, new challenges began to emerge. His cybersecurity firm had become a trusted name in the industry, and his reputation as a visionary leader was growing. But with success came new enemies, ones who operated in the shadows. Nathan began receiving anonymous threats, cryptic messages warning him to stay out of what doesn't concern you. At first, Nathan dismissed them, thinking they were just the ramblings of some disgruntled competitor. However, the threats escalated. His company's network was targeted by sophisticated attacks. His employees' personal information was leaked online, and even his private conversations with Mia were intercepted. Whoever was behind it had the resources to make things personal. Nathan couldn't ignore it anymore. He assembled his top team, including Grace Elliott, his trusted investigator, and Mia, who had become not only a partner in business but also a confidant. They started digging deeper, trying to connect the dots and figure out who had the means and motive to target him. Their investigation led them to a group that had eluded authorities for years, the Black Net Syndicate. An underground collective of hackers, criminals, and corporate espionage experts, the Black Net Syndicate was rumored to be responsible for some of the most high-profile cybercrimes in recent history. They operated in the shadows, leaving no trace behind, and had ties to corrupt businessmen, politicians, and even tech giants with something to hide. Nathan realized that his rise in the cybersecurity world had made him a target for them. The more successful his company became, the more likely he was to uncover something they wanted kept hidden. And now, they were coming for him with everything they had. Grace, who had extensive experience in the world of private investigations, revealed that the syndicate had once targeted her in the past, and she had barely escaped with her life. This personal vendetta made her more determined than ever to bring them down, but it also put her in danger, as the syndicate had long memories. Nathan knew that to fight back, he needed allies. As the investigation progressed, he found himself reaching out to unlikely sources. One of those sources was Alex King, a former hacker turned whistleblower, who had once been a part of the Black Net Syndicate but had defected after growing disillusioned with their operations. He had knowledge of their inner workings, and he agreed to help Nathan, but only if Nathan could promise to protect him from the syndicate's retribution. Nathan was hesitant. Trusting a former hacker was risky, but Alex's insights were too valuable to ignore. They agreed on a temporary alliance. Alex helped Nathan uncover a series of hidden server locations where the syndicate's illegal activities were stored. This was the breakthrough Nathan needed. If they could expose the syndicate's operations, they could bring them down once and for all. However, the stakes were higher than ever. Nathan's life and the lives of those close to him were now in jeopardy. The syndicate had no qualms about silencing anyone who got in their way, and Nathan knew that they wouldn't hesitate to target his loved ones. With their plans set, Nathan, Mia, Grace, and Alex went on the offensive. They worked around the clock, deciphering codes, infiltrating networks, and gathering evidence to expose the syndicate. Every lead they followed seemed to take them deeper into a web of corruption that stretched further than they could have imagined. Politicians, tech giants, and even law enforcement had ties to the Black Net syndicate, making it increasingly difficult to know who they could trust. At the same time, the syndicate wasn't sitting idly by. They launched an all-out cyber war against Nathan's company, trying to cripple his operations and destroy the evidence he was uncovering. Nathan found himself once again in a race against time, only this time, the stakes were much higher. His company's survival, his freedom, and the safety of everyone he cared about were on the line. During one particularly harrowing night, as Nathan and his team were preparing to release key evidence to the authorities, Grace discovered something chilling, an encrypted file containing a list of names. Her face drained of color when she recognized one of the names. It was Nathan's. The syndicate had placed a bounty on his head, and the hunt for him had officially begun. Just when Nathan thought things couldn't get worse, a shocking betrayal came from within his own ranks. Alex, the hacker-turned-whistleblower, had been feeding information back to the syndicate all along. The promise of protection in exchange for his cooperation had been a lie. Nathan's trust in Alex had been misplaced, and now the syndicate had gained access to all of their plans. Mia, who had grown to trust Alex, was devastated by the betrayal. She had been the one to convince Nathan to trust Alex, and now she felt responsible for the mess they were in. But Nathan, ever the strategist, knew they couldn't waste time on regret. They had to move fast and regroup. With their plans compromised, Nathan knew they had only one shot left to bring down the syndicate. He called in favors from old contacts, former allies, business rivals, and even a few government officials who were on his side. They would use everything at their disposal to take down the Black Net syndicate once and for all. The final showdown was inevitable. Nathan, Mia, and Grace made their way to the last known location of the syndicate's central server farm, a remote facility tucked away in a private compound in the mountains. The mission was high risk, and the odds of survival were slim. But Nathan wasn't going to back down. His entire life had led to this moment, and he was determined to see it through to the end. As they neared the compound, Nathan could feel the weight of what was at stake. He had lost so much already, his marriage, his trust in people, and his sense of security. But now, in this final confrontation, he had everything to gain. If he succeeded, he would not only bring justice to those who had wronged him, but he would also ensure that no one else would have to suffer the same fate. As they prepared to breach the compound, Grace turned to Nathan with a look of resolve. "No matter what happens, we finish this. For good." Nathan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "For good," he repeated. The team stormed the compound, fully aware that their lives could end that night. The final confrontation with the Black Net syndicate had begun, and there would be no turning back. The compound was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that signaled something dangerous was about to unfold. Nathan, Mia, and Grace moved cautiously through the dense forest surrounding the heavily guarded facility, their night vision goggles barely illuminating the narrow path. They knew time was running out. Once the syndicate realized they were coming, all hell would break loose. Using a combination of stealth and technology, they bypassed the outer security systems and breached the first line of defense. The real challenge was still ahead. The central server farm lay deep inside the compound, hidden within a labyrinth of corridors and guarded by layers of security, both digital and physical. But Nathan had already anticipated this. He had planted key pieces of software that would disable the compound surveillance cameras, and Grace was able to hack into the security system from a hidden terminal they had accessed. Just as they reached the main building, a sudden burst of gunfire rang out. Nathan ducked behind a concrete wall, adrenaline surging through his veins. Grace grabbed Mia and pulled her to the ground as several armed guards stormed the area. The compound was no longer passive, they had been discovered. The mission had gone from covert to all-out assault in a matter of seconds. Nathan's heart raced as he gestured for his team to fall back into a more secure position. Their only chance now was to fight their way through and get to the servers before the syndicate's enforcers did. As the gunfire intensified, Nathan's mind raced. The syndicate knew they were coming. There was no way they could have bypassed all those security measures without being noticed. They must have had spies in place, waiting for the moment of attack. Nathan knew this wasn't just about taking down a criminal organization anymore, this was about survival. "Stay close and keep moving," Nathan ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We push forward. We can't let them delay us." But as they advanced deeper into the compound, they faced increasing resistance. The halls of the facility were lined with heavily armed mercenaries, those loyal to the Black Net Syndicate, willing to fight to the death to protect their empire. Nathan knew these men were ruthless, trained to kill without hesitation. The odds of getting out alive were growing slimmer by the minute. In the midst of the firefight, Grace hacked into another terminal to access the facility's power grid. If they could disable the lights and communications, they might be able to gain the upper hand. Mia, armed with a rifle, provided cover fire as Grace worked quickly. Just as Grace initiated the shutdown, the lights flickered, and the compound was plunged into darkness. Panic swept through the mercenaries as they struggled to regain control of the situation. This was their opening. Nathan signaled for the team to move fast. Navigating in the dark was disorienting, but Nathan trusted his instincts. They had come too far to fail now. With the power cut, the compound security systems were down, but the physical defenses remained intact. They needed to get to the heart of the facility, the central server room, where all the incriminating evidence was stored. The corridors were a maze of concrete and steel, but Nathan's team pushed forward. With each step, they could hear the echoes of approaching footsteps, more mercenaries closing in. They couldn't afford to waste time. At last, they arrived at the central server room. Nathan motioned for Grace to get to work while Mia and he set up a perimeter. They had to be ready for whatever came next. Grace tapped away furiously at the terminal. "It's not just about getting the evidence. The servers are booby-trapped. If we don't disable the kill switch, everything will be erased before we can upload it." Nathan's blood ran cold. The syndicate had thought ahead. If they couldn't stop the kill switch, everything would be lost. Every document, every email, every piece of evidence would be wiped out in an instant. "I'll buy you time," Nathan said, motioning to Mia. "Keep them off us." Mia nodded grimly. "Let's do this." As Nathan prepared to defend their position, Grace worked furiously on the console, her fingers dancing over the keys. The tension was palpable. Outside the server room, the sound of boots echoed, signaling the imminent arrival of their enemies. Nathan braced himself, knowing that they were running out of time. Moments later, the mercenaries burst into the room. The firefight was intense, and Nathan and Mia fought tooth and nail to hold them off. The server room had become a war zone, and it was clear that this would be their last stand. Grace, despite the chaos, remained focused on her task. "Almost there," she shouted over the sounds of gunfire. Nathan's eyes locked with Mia's as they exchanged a brief, determined look. They knew that they couldn't afford to lose now. They had come too far. Suddenly, there was a loud crash as one of the mercenaries broke through the door. Nathan shot first, taking him down before the intruder could get a shot off. But more were coming. Mia fired rapidly, her aim true as she picked off one assailant after another. Nathan had never seen her fight with such intensity, and he realized how much she had grown since their first meeting. She wasn't just a partner anymore, she was his equal in every sense. "Got it!" Grace exclaimed, her voice full of triumph. "The kill switch is disabled. We have the data." Nathan let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Time to go," he said, motioning for them to move. But just as they turned to leave, a voice echoed through the speakers in the room, calm and calculated. "Not so fast, Nathan." Nathan froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Simon Reed. "I thought you'd never figure it out," Simon continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "You really think you could bring down the Black Net Syndicate? You really think you can just waltz in and take our secrets? You're a fool, Nathan." The realization hit Nathan like a ton of bricks. Simon had been more than just an accomplice in Islah's betrayal, he was the architect of the syndicate's rise to power. Everything, the fraud, the cyber attacks, even the strategic alliances they had made, had been Simon's doing. He was the mastermind behind it all. Nathan's hands clenched into fists as he realized the true depth of the betrayal. Simon hadn't just ruined his marriage, he had masterminded an entire network of deceit, and now, he was about to finish the job. "You won't get away with this," Nathan snarled. Simon laughed. "I already have." Suddenly, the sound of doors slamming shut echoed through the compound. Nathan's heart sank as he realized they were trapped. The walls were closing in on them. The fight for survival had just become even more desperate. The door to the server room slammed shut with a deafening thud. Nathan, Mia, and Grace turned to face the room, their backs against the walls, the sound of footsteps echoing ominously outside. Simon's voice was still ringing in their ears, a sinister reminder of how far he'd gone to ensure his empire remained intact. Mia's eyes scanned the room, her hands gripping her weapon tightly. "We're not going out like this," she said, her tone fierce. "There's always a way." Nathan nodded, though his mind was racing. The walls had been sealed, and the compound was crawling with mercenaries. They were isolated now, with only a few exits that were heavily guarded. The mission had shifted from securing the evidence to a desperate fight for survival. The evidence they had gathered, proof of the syndicate's crimes, was now their only bargaining chip. If they didn't get out, everything they had worked for would be lost. Grace had already begun to hack into the server, extracting the crucial files. "I've got the data," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "But we need to move. The syndicate has activated lockdown protocols. There's no way out unless we disable them. Can you override it?" Nathan asked, keeping his voice steady despite the growing pressure. "I can try," she replied, her eyes focused intently on the screen. "But I'll need a few minutes. I'll guide you through the process, but you'll need to hold them off." Mia was already setting up a defensive perimeter, her eyes scanning for any movement through the cracks in the walls. Nathan checked his weapon, the weight of the situation sinking in. It was clear now that Simon's involvement was deeper than they had ever imagined. He had been the one pulling the strings from the very beginning, orchestrating everything, including the betrayal that had almost destroyed Nathan's life. "We need to buy Grace some time," Nathan said, his voice firm. "Mia, you take the left side. I'll cover the right." Without a word, Mia moved into position, her expression set in grim determination. Nathan took up his own position, keeping low and using the shadows to his advantage. The mercenaries would come soon, he knew it. The compound was their territory, and they were relentless in defending it. The seconds dragged on, but the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps growing nearer. The mercenaries were approaching, their boots thudding against the concrete floor, their weapons at the ready. Nathan's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Through a small slit in the door, he saw the silhouettes of two armed men moving past the room. He signaled to Mia, who shifted silently into position. They couldn't risk being spotted, so every move had to be precise. One of the mercenaries glanced toward the server room door. Nathan didn't hesitate. He fired first, taking the guard out with a single shot. Mia was right behind him, dispatching the second guard swiftly and silently. The mercenaries didn't know what hit them. But there were more. They knew by now that the server room was the key to everything. As more guards closed in, Nathan and Mia continued to pick them off one by one, but the sheer number of enemies was starting to wear them down. For every mercenary they eliminated, two more seemed to appear in their place. Grace's fingers flew over the console as she worked to disable the lockdown protocols. "Just a little longer," she muttered under her breath, sweat beading on her forehead. "I almost have it, just need a few more seconds." The tension in the room was palpable. Nathan felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His team was holding their own, but they couldn't keep this up forever. Then, the door to the server room burst open. Four heavily armed mercenaries rushed in, guns blazing. Nathan dove for cover, narrowly avoiding a bullet that slammed into the concrete just inches from him. Mia, always quick on her feet, fired back, taking down two of the attackers with precision shots. Nathan and Mia traded fire with the mercenaries as Grace continued her work. Each shot rang out, echoing through the compound, but there was no time to savor any victories. Every second counted. As Nathan moved to flank the remaining mercenaries, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Nathan." He froze, recognizing the voice immediately. His blood ran cold. It was Isla. She stepped into the room, flanked by two more mercenaries. Her presence sent a jolt of shock through Nathan's system. The last thing he expected was to see his estranged wife, the woman who had once betrayed him, standing among the very people he was trying to take down. Isla's eyes met his, and for a split second, there was a flicker of hesitation in her gaze. Then she spoke, her voice cold and composed. "You should have known, Nathan. It was never about Simon. It was about power, about controlling everything. You were always just a pawn in a much larger game." Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. Isla had been working with the syndicate the entire time, a fact that shook him to his core. All those years, all those memories, they had all been part of a carefully constructed lie. "You don't have to do this, Isla," Nathan said, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to be part of this. It's not too late." But Isla's expression didn't change. She didn't seem surprised by his words. If anything, she seemed resigned to the path she had chosen. "I'm not here for your redemption, Nathan," she said, her eyes narrowing. "I'm here to finish what we started. The syndicate is beyond you now. You should have stayed out of it." The mercenaries raised their weapons, aiming directly at Nathan and Mia. Grace, still working frantically, glanced over her shoulder. "I'm almost there," she called out, her voice laced with desperation. Nathan's mind raced. Isla had always been intelligent, strategic. This wasn't just about loyalty to Simon, it was about her own ambitions. She had chosen her side, and there was no turning back now. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Nathan made a snap decision. "Mia, cover me." He darted toward Grace, pushing past the chaos of gunfire. The mercenaries opened fire as Nathan sprinted across the room, the bullets ricocheting around him. He dove behind a console and quickly repositioned himself, all while keeping an eye on Grace. "Grace!" Nathan shouted. "I need that door open, now." "I'm working on it," she replied, her fingers flying over the console, the pressure mounting with each passing second. Isla's voice broke through the noise again. "You're wasting your time, Nathan. You'll never get out of here. We control everything now." Nathan ignored her, focusing on the task at hand. Mia continued to suppress the mercenaries, but the odds were rapidly turning against them. With one final, calculated keystroke, Grace broke through the last layer of security. "Done," she shouted. The door to the server room slid open, revealing a narrow escape route. Nathan wasted no time. He grabbed Grace's arm and pulled her toward the exit. "Go," Nathan ordered Mia. "We're not done yet." As they fled into the darkness of the facility, the weight of the situation pressed down on them. The escape was far from certain, but it was their only chance now. The final confrontation was still far from over. Simon, Isla, and the syndicate were relentless, and Nathan had no illusions about how much more they would have to endure before the battle was truly over. But for the first time in a long while, Nathan felt a spark of hope. They had the evidence. They had the power to bring down the syndicate. And they were still alive to fight for it. The war was far from over. Nathan, Mia, and Grace sprinted through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing like gunfire against the walls. They had escaped the server room, but the danger was far from over. The compound had been thrown into chaos, and Simon, Isla, and the syndicate's forces were closing in on them fast. Their only hope now was to make it to the extraction point, a hidden location on the compound's perimeter, where a private helicopter was waiting to take them to safety. Nathan could feel the weight of their mission pressing on him. They had the evidence they needed to bring down the Black Net Syndicate. Every second counted. But as they navigated the maze of hallways, the tension in the air grew thick. The mercenaries were closing in, and they had no time to waste. "We need to keep moving," Nathan said, his voice steady despite the chaos. He could hear the distant sound of footsteps behind them, growing louder as they approached. "Grace, how much farther?" "I've mapped out the quickest route," Grace replied, her voice calm but tight with urgency. "Just a few more turns. But we have to hurry. They'll be on us any minute." Mia glanced over her shoulder. "We're not out of the woods yet." Nathan nodded. They had to make it. No matter what it took, they couldn't let the syndicate get their hands on the evidence. If they did, everything they'd worked for, the countless hours of planning, the betrayals, the sacrifices, would be for nothing. As they rounded a corner, a series of muffled gunshots rang out. The sound sent a chill down Nathan's spine. He didn't need to look back to know that mercenaries were closing in from both sides. They were being hunted. "Split up," Nathan barked. "Take different routes. We meet at the extraction point." Mia didn't hesitate. Without a word, she darted down a side hallway, disappearing into the shadows. Nathan turned to Grace. "Ready?" "Let's go," Grace replied, her eyes steely with determination. They ran, weaving through the narrow passageways, each turn taking them deeper into the heart of the compound. The sounds of gunfire continued to echo behind them, but there was no turning back now. They had to reach that extraction point. Suddenly, Nathan heard a familiar voice, low, taunting, and unmistakable. "Running again, Nathan." It was Simon. Nathan's pulse spiked. He knew they had to be close to the extraction point now. Simon was getting desperate, and that desperation made him dangerous. They had no more time to waste. The mission was no longer just about exposing the syndicate, it was about survival. "We have to move faster," Nathan said, his voice hard. "Grace, can you see a way to the roof?" "Yes," Grace replied, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the map in her mind. "The next stairwell leads to the upper levels. We can take the elevator shaft to the roof from there." Nathan gritted his teeth. Every move they made was calculated, but Simon and his mercenaries were relentless. The closer they got to the extraction point, the more likely they were to be ambushed. He had to stay one step ahead. As they approached the stairwell, Nathan caught a glimpse of Simon at the far end of the hallway. His face was cold, calculating. There was no trace of hesitation or remorse. The man standing in front of him wasn't the Simon he had once called a friend. This was the leader of a criminal empire, a man willing to do whatever it took to protect his interests. "Give it up, Nathan," Simon called out. "You can't escape me. This game is over." Nathan didn't answer. He couldn't afford to waste time with Simon's mind games. His focus was on the task at hand, getting to that rooftop and escaping with the evidence. But Simon was blocking the way. His mercenaries were already closing in from both sides. "I won't let you destroy everything we've built," Simon continued. "You think you've won, but you're just a pawn. Always have been. Always will be." Nathan's hands tightened around the gun in his holster. He wasn't a pawn anymore. He had built something of his own, a life, a company, a future. And he wasn't going to let Simon take it from him. "You're wrong," Nathan said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "This ends tonight." With a sudden burst of movement, Nathan fired. The shot was precise, taking down one of Simon's mercenaries before they could react. Grace quickly followed suit, dropping another guard with a well-aimed shot. But Simon didn't flinch. He simply gestured for his remaining men to move forward. "Isla!" Nathan shouted, his heart pounding. "This is your chance. You don't have to be a part of this." Isla stepped forward, her gaze unreadable. She didn't speak at first, but Nathan saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. For a brief moment, she seemed almost torn. Then, with a cold, almost mechanical motion, she nodded to Simon. "Finish it," she said softly, her voice betraying nothing of the emotions that might have been swirling inside her. The moment she spoke those words, Nathan's heart sank. Isla was beyond redemption. There was no saving her. And now, there was no more time to waste. As Simon's men closed in, Nathan and Grace made a break for the stairwell. They sprinted up the narrow staircase, pushing through the pain in their legs, adrenaline fueling their every move. The sound of gunfire echoed through the compound, but they couldn't afford to look back. They reached the rooftop in a matter of seconds, and Nathan could already hear the distant whir of the helicopter blades. "Almost there," Grace shouted. But as they reached the roof's edge, they saw the helicopter, hovering just beyond their reach, its engines roaring. They weren't alone. A dozen mercenaries had already positioned themselves around the helicopter, weapons drawn. It was a trap. Simon's voice came through the radio, loud and mocking. "You think you've won, Nathan? You're not getting away. Not this time." Nathan's eyes narrowed as he scanned the situation. There was no way they could take on that many mercenaries and survive. His heart raced as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about exposing the syndicate anymore. It was about getting out alive. "We're not done yet," Nathan muttered, his mind working quickly. He turned to Grace. "We'll have to fight our way out. But we need a distraction." Grace nodded, already knowing what he meant. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small device. "This will give us the opening we need." "Do it," Nathan said, his voice unwavering. Grace pressed a button on the device, and a massive explosion rocked the compound. The force sent several of Simon's men flying back, throwing them into disarray. The distraction was their chance. "Go!" Nathan yelled. They dashed toward the helicopter, dodging bullets as the remaining mercenaries regrouped. Grace was already on the ladder, climbing up to the cockpit. Nathan followed closely behind, his heart pounding. They had one shot to escape, and they were taking it. As they reached the helicopter, Nathan looked back one last time. Simon and Isla stood at the edge of the roof, their faces twisted in fury. But they were too late. The helicopter lifted off, soaring into the night sky. For the first time in a long while, Nathan allowed himself to breathe. As the helicopter climbed higher into the night sky, Nathan glanced at Grace, who was staring out the window, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Nathan didn't answer immediately. There was still so much left to do. The evidence they had gathered could bring down the entire syndicate, but it would take time. And Simon. Simon wouldn't stop. Not until he was completely dismantled. "Not yet," Nathan said finally. "But we've taken the first step." Grace nodded, her expression softening. "And what happens now?" Nathan looked ahead, a sense of determination settling over him. "Now, we rebuild. Together." The helicopter sliced through the night sky, the city lights below a blur of shimmering lights. Nathan leaned back in his seat, trying to collect his thoughts. His chest still heaved with the adrenaline of the escape, but the weight of what lay ahead was already pressing on him. Grace was silent beside him, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her hands gripping the edges of the seat. Nathan knew she was processing everything just as he was. There was still a long road ahead. But at least they had survived. They had escaped with the evidence, and that was all that mattered now. "We made it," Grace said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but steady, the exhaustion from the past hours evident in her tone. Nathan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "We made it, but it's not over. Simon and the syndicate, they won't stop. They still have their reach." Grace turned to him, her gaze thoughtful. "So what now?" "We expose them. Exposing them is just the beginning. We need to make sure they can't recover. Simon has too much power, and we've only scratched the surface. We need to dismantle everything, the networks, the contacts, the people he has in place. It's going to take more than just evidence. We need to hit them where it hurts." "And what about Isla?" Grace asked, her expression softening as she spoke his wife's name. Nathan's jaw tightened. The betrayal still stung, but it was a different kind of pain now. One born of loss, of a life that was never truly his to begin with. Isla chose her side. "She's too far gone. I can't waste any more time trying to save her." Grace nodded, understanding. "You've made the right choice, Nathan. You can't change the past, but you can shape the future." Nathan looked out the window, the world below them growing smaller. That's the only thing that matters now. The weeks following their escape were a blur of strategic meetings, long nights, and relentless planning. Nathan and Grace worked tirelessly, leveraging the evidence they had gathered to infiltrate the syndicate's operations from the inside out. They made alliances with law enforcement, international intelligence agencies, and even former rivals of Simon, all of whom had an interest in bringing the Black Net Syndicate down. It wasn't easy. Every step forward was met with resistance, every move carefully countered by Simon's ever-watchful eye. But Nathan had the one thing Simon could never take from him, the truth. The data Grace had extracted from the server was more than just evidence of criminal activity. It was a roadmap. Each piece of information unlocked another, revealing a complex web of corruption, money laundering, and illegal arms dealing that stretched across borders and governments. They used this data to expose key figures in the syndicate, causing ripples through the criminal world. But every victory came at a cost. Simon had resources, allies, and a network that would stop at nothing to protect their empire. Every time we take down one of his men, 2 more pop up, Grace said, frustration creeping into her voice. How does he do it? Nathan didn't have an answer. He didn't care about the details. What mattered was the bigger picture. We hit him where it hurts. The money. The connections. Once we take those away, everything else will collapse. They worked in the shadows, gathering intel, disrupting operations, and watching as Simon's empire began to show cracks. But the more they pushed, the more dangerous it became. They weren't just dealing with criminals anymore, they were up against a network that had infiltrated almost every level of power. One night, as Nathan and Grace were deep in discussion, an unexpected message arrived. It was from an anonymous source, encrypted beyond anything they had seen before. It's Simon, Grace said as she decrypted the message. He knows. He's coming for us. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. How? I don't know, Grace replied. But he's making his move. He's pulling all his assets together. The final showdown is coming. Nathan's eyes narrowed. He'd known it was coming. Simon had always been a step ahead, but now, the game was about to reach its climax. We can't wait for him to come to us. We need to take the fight to him. Grace met his gaze, her expression resolute. Then let's finish this. They immediately began preparing for the final assault. They couldn't afford any more missteps. Every detail had to be perfect. They set their sights on Simon's strongest hold, a fortified compound deep in the mountains, rumored to house the syndicate's most valuable assets, including Simon himself. It was the heart of the Black Net Syndicate, and if they could take it down, they could cripple Simon's operations for good. Nathan and Grace weren't going in alone. They had allies now, law enforcement, former mercenaries, and hackers who had helped expose the syndicate's financial operations. Together, they would storm the compound, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. Simon would not go down without a fight. The night before the assault, Nathan sat alone in his safe house, staring at the files they had gathered over the past months. The final pieces were in place. There was no turning back now. Grace entered the room, her face weary but determined. You ready for this? Nathan didn't look up. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for everyone he's hurt. For the people who never had a voice. Grace sat beside him. We're not just fighting for revenge, Nathan. We're fighting for a future. He looked at her then, the weight of her words sinking in. You're right. It's bigger than just us. The next morning, they mobilized. The team was prepared for what lay ahead, but even as they approached the compound, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Simon wasn't one to leave his base undefended, and there were too many unknowns. But it was too late for second thoughts. As they stormed the gates, gunfire erupted from every direction. The mercenaries were waiting, but so were Simon and his closest allies. It was a battle for everything they had worked for, and Nathan wasn't going to lose. The fighting was brutal. The compound security was high, and the mercenaries didn't hold back. Nathan led the charge, pushing forward, determined to take Simon down once and for all. As they reached the inner sanctum of the compound, the door to Simon's command center burst open. And there he was, Simon, standing in the middle of the room, his cold eyes watching as Nathan and Grace entered. It's over, Nathan, Simon said, his voice calm, almost bored. You've lost. You always will. Nathan's heart raced. He wasn't just fighting for survival now. He was fighting for everything that had been stolen from him, his trust, his future, his life. "I'm not the one who's lost, Simon," Nathan said, his voice steady. "You are." As the two men faced each other, the tension in the air thickened. Simon's smile was cruel. "You think you've won? You think you can defeat me? You're just a man, Nathan. Nothing more. And in the end, nothing will change." Nathan clenched his fists, his mind working through the final step. He couldn't afford to underestimate Simon now. He needed to be smarter, he needed to be unpredictable. With a sudden move, Nathan lunged forward, knocking Simon off balance. A struggle broke out between them, the fight raw and vicious. But this time, Nathan was in control. Every punch, every move, was calculated. Finally, with one swift motion, Nathan incapacitated Simon. His empire was crumbling. The evidence they had gathered was now in the hands of the authorities. And Simon, his greatest adversary, was defeated. As Simon was taken into custody, the sun began to rise over the compound, signaling the end of a long, dark chapter. Nathan and Grace stood together, knowing that their fight was over. But the world they had fought to protect would now be different. The work was far from finished, but they had taken the first step toward a new beginning. Months passed. The syndicate was dismantled, its leaders either arrested or neutralized. Nathan's company thrived, no longer just a venture for profit, but a beacon for change in a world that desperately needed it. Grace stood by his side, a partner in every sense of the word, and together, they began to rebuild. Nathan had found redemption not just through the fall of Simon, but through the rebuilding of his own life. He had faced the darkness and emerged stronger for it. And in doing so, he had found a future filled with hope. Though the scars of the past would never fully fade, Nathan had learned one crucial lesson: sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones that teach us who we truly are. And with that, the story of the Black Net Syndicate came to its end. But for Nathan and Grace, this was only the beginning. And just like that, the battle isn't over. Nathan's journey is far from complete, and the dark forces at play have yet to show all their cards. What happens next? Will Nathan and Grace finally take down the Black Net Syndicate, or will betrayal tear them apart once more? Stay tuned, because the twists are far from over. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your predictions on what comes next and which character you think will rise above it all. And if you want to be part of the action, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. There's so much more to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.